Good evening, everybody. Hello. It is my pleasure to introduce Sean Lally, the 2018 Miles H. Thaler Lecturer and Visiting Professor. Sean is educated as a landscape architect with his BLA from UMASS Amherst and as an architect with his MArch from UCLA. He is currently a tenured professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Architecture, Design, and the Arts, and a recipient of the Prince Charitable Trust Rome Prize. On the surface, Sean seems to have a quixotic body of work that confuses the disciplinary boundaries of architecture, landscape architecture, art, and the sciences. In most ways, you would not be wrong in this assumption, but not everything is so readily apparent. I've had the pleasure of understanding and studying Sean Lally's work over the past decade as it has inspired my own research and design work. Sean Lally is unique in our disciplines, finding ways to ask fundamental questions about humanity and the environment we are living in today, to imagine a future for our existence as a species. In the Department of Landscape Architecture at UVA, we have stated our mission as the design of the environment as a meaningful expression of what it means to be human in our time. Sean's body of work examines that expression in future conditions as a way to guide humanity into a future where new fields of design potential are opening. I was first introduced to Sean's work through his research practice, Weathers. The work of Weathers examined the relationship between energy and architecture, particularly the manipulation, management, and choreography of the ephemeral. The early projects, such as Wanderings or the Storefront for Art and Architecture proposal, Does Central Park Dream of Electric Shapes, set a tone for the ephemeral, that it can have form and that this form can have social consequences. These projects gave an urgency for the understanding of energy with an imbued aesthetic and applied rigor. The work of Weathers coalesced with an intriguing manuscript that was published in 2014, The Air from Other Planets. A great description of the book's impact is that it makes us nostalgic for the future, because it not only speaks to how we might harness these ephemeral energy systems, but also live rich and varied lives within them. While Weathers, as a research firm, has retired, the investigations continue through his work, some of which we'll see today. Sean's work in this realm is helping to shape a discourse that speaks to design methodologies that expand the scale of what we consider sight, from modifications of our bodies to the engineering of our planet. This exploration expresses an overlap in his background in architecture and landscape architecture, and a questioning of the natural and the synthetic. This conversation goes beyond the design disciplines and occurs with his podcast, Night White Skies, a series of interviews that examines design futures, and quoting Sean as both the Earth's environment and the human body are now open for design. In a world with an abundance of computation and rapidly shifting sociocultural contexts, Night White Skies is forming the dialogue and stitching together the individuals necessary for a rich conversation around our future as designers. If you've not had a chance to listen to the podcast, I highly recommend it. With that being said, it goes without saying, I've been looking forward to the lecture tonight. So please help me in welcoming the 2018 Miles M. Thaler Lecturer, Sean Lally.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Well, thank you for having me. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Isla, for the invitation to teach here this semester. I've really enjoyed it. Yes, nice. So for tonight, I'm talking about, this is more of a work in progress than it is a kind of culmination of something particular. And it's working under sometimes, I think there's different ways of approaching a project, and maybe I learned this earlier on, which is give it a title and then work backwards. So the title of this is called An Architecture of Shape Touches, which is just to say how to start questioning as architects, as landscape architects, how we define shape and give aesthetics and spatial configurations. Like what is it that, how we can think about shape as designers, shape or form. And the fact that when so much is in flux right now, in terms of whether we want to talk about the environment in terms of climate change and its unpredictability of it and where that will be going, to even our own bodies with wearable technologies, bioengineering, healthcare. What does that mean for how we kind of perceive space? And so this is a kind of conversation about that. And so it's unlikely that any of you would predict that. Well, How should I move forward? This one. I think there's more than one slide, but I'm not sure. So there goes the punchline. My friend Donald Rumsfeld. Many winced when first hearing then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's convoluted logic of knowns and unknowns. Yet this terminology now seems somehow prescient for examining the challenges ahead related to the environment and our human subjectivity. Rumsfeld's logic, this particular Department of Defense news briefing was, quote, there are known knowns, there are things that we know we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things that we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, end quote. So you're laughing, but there's going to be a lot of unknown unknowns today. So simply stated, sometimes we just aren't aware of what we don't know. Earth's changing environment and our evolving human bodies are now so much in flux that it is difficult to pinpoint their developmental trajectories. These would therefore be identified as known unknowns. Specific scenarios related to social, political, and aesthetic organizations tied to this conversation could, however, be best understood as unknown unknowns. The question at hand is this: can we develop strategies to pull these unknowns into the present? So even though it sounds actually completely convoluted, that's when we'll be talking about unknowns. And I was with one of those people too, hearing Rumsfeld talking about this and just thinking he had lost his mind. But in reality, he was likely thinking of, maybe not specifically, but this type of research and chart. I mean, this is something called Johari Window, and it was a technique that helps people better understand the relationships to themselves and others. It was developed in the 50s, and it was mostly used for kind of self-help groups and corporate settings to kind of understand and explore relationships of the kind of corporate world and the individuals. But this kind of little scenario was also something that intelligence, military and government intelligence agencies had been using for a while to try to understand and play out possible scenarios. So even though he doesn't direct it and say it specifically, this is probably, I might be giving him too much credit, something that was sort of in the wind when he talks about his unknowns. Rumsfeld's comments in 2002 came 2 years prior to the founding of Facebook in 2004. Individuals invested in social media platforms at the time might not have seen Facebook as having an inevitable existence, but previous trends in MySpace and Friendster could be said to identify it as a known unknown. However, the role Facebook would play in the 2016 U.S. elections could only be characterized as an unknown unknown in 2002. Unknown unknowns are intangible and inaccessible, but that they can be brought into focus through the incremental multiplying of these known unknowns, derived by scenario building, speculations, and which eventually turns Facebook's 2016 involvement in elections into a known known by 2010, as researchers and developers highlighted the existence of or similar data breaches at that time. These breaches had not yet been capitalized by a foreign power to anyone's knowledge, but would have been to have made that leap to that such a scenario would have been possible. So here we are looking at the World Trade Center. 2002 is when this is the sort of rough construction plan of the World Trade Center from 2002 to 2014. Within nearly every architectural project, architects make two fundamental assumptions. The site and the subjects that will occupy that site are seen to be known knowns. However, any architectural project that has a lifespan of more than just several years at this point has to now be seen, has to see such assumptions as a luxury that can no longer carry forward. Neither the environmental climates that will exist, nor the technological human physiologies that will inhabit those spaces can be assumed to be known exactly. This raises a minimum of two questions. What should architecture be if it can no longer make long-term projections about the stasis of either our sites or our bodies? And how might architecture go about making design decisions when such two fundamental starting points are assumed to be in a state of flux? Architectural exercises that culminate in delivering a form of stasis therefore seem questionable. So this is, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I was at a conference that Sean Rickenbacker organized in Philadelphia at UPenn called Non-Discrete Architectures. And someone by the name of Campbell Hayers presented something similar to this. I've contacted him and never got a reply to sort of look at some of this work that he was doing. So I kind of jerry-rigged my own version of it, looking at essentially the construction of one project. Obviously, it's a unusual project due to its political backstory and ownership of it and so on and so forth and size of it, but this is a span of from 2000 to 2014. And just to give you an idea of the scale of something like this, when you look at the kind of timeline from a building like this, you realize that when you think about social media, that when this building was designed until it was completed, things like Facebook launched, YouTube launched, Twitter launched, Apple iPhone is only in 2007, Amazon Reader, Netflix, Instagram. All of these aspects of social media weren't even in existence prior to the construction of this project. Add to that things like the Human Genome Project, sequencing project, which took over a decade to do, started culminated in 2003. You have the space shuttle retires, gene editing, like CRISPR, it comes into existence. Something like the Human Genome Project costs $2.7 billion to sequence. By 2013, it's $5,000. It's 2018, it's something like $200 now if you want to sequence your genes. So in the time span of something like this and how quickly these things move. Tesla comes into existence. And since then, we go from things like our CO2 levels right in 2015 hit 400 parts per million. Liquid water is discovered on Mars, and Facebook is involved in the U.S. elections. So just as a kind of example of like how fast things do move and how fast within some of these technologies and how we're interacting with each other, just to say things like social media and some of our discoveries that are being kind of discovered as we move forward are just happening at such a rate. The question is, when you look at it through the scale of a building project, just like what we're talking about here. Speed and the increase in information increases. Oops, sorry. Donald Rumsfeld and author social anthropologist Donna Haraway likely share little more in common with each other beyond an interest in language repetition. In Staying with the Trouble, Haraway goes to great lengths to demonstrate techniques for fostering connections that might otherwise not go recognized. These connections include relationships both within and beyond our own species, as an attempt to know ourselves and bring new perspectives to the environment we live in. Tentacles, making kin, or string figures are each strategies of Haraway that attempts to formulate new questions before assuming solutions. To engage the extent of these implications, Haraway refers to the approach as playing with string figures, or influences of tentacles that reach out and intertwine with the surrounding world. Looping these strings to diverse and unexpected anchor points produces exchanges of information and relationships that might offer new perspectives about both where we currently find ourselves and where we might be going. The articulation of tentacle relationships is an interface with change. This change includes a warming planet, mass extinction of animal and plant species, increased knowledge of the working of the human body, coupled with technologies that can enhance the body and increase computer intelligence, just to name four. Has humanity ever existed while knowingly being aware of so much potential change and uncertainty still to unfold? So when we're looking at things like our human perception, This is just one example. We'll look at examples both of the human body, but then also of material energies and what we have access to in terms of the manipulation of the environment, whether we do it intentionally or otherwise. Usually it's otherwise. So when we think about augmented sensory perception, an increased ability for individuals to perceive changes in the makeup of the environment is occurring through the mediation of garments and objects with the human body that wears them. So sometimes this is things that are happening chemically. Sometimes these are things that you can wear, like your watch, ear pods, or clothing. And sometimes these are things that are done through healthcare actions. So on the spectrum here, you have on the far right, you're looking at Seoul National University in Korea, where you're looking at examples of say, skin, where you can actually work with sensors that recreate the skin so that you can actually feel and touch. You're looking at someone like Kevin Warwick with New Senses. This is someone who has invested in trying to not only look at extending our own sensory perception of things like wearing glasses or being able to hear better, but actually taking on sensory perception that exists beyond the human spectrum. And so this is a case in which he is using sonar to actually perceive space. So something that a bat would have. So something that is not analogous to anything we currently already do. So in this experiment, he puts on a sonar on his cap. He's blindfolded. He has that then go to a computer. That computer then is connected to his central nervous system in his arm, and those signals are sent into his body. And within several hours to a day, he's actually able to perceive and understand those waves of information as it comes in contact with his body and it moves to his brain. And so he's a really interesting person because he, as a scientist, writes white papers you can actually read and mostly understand in terms of how he's doing this. But it also really underlies the point that a central nervous system is basically much more plastic and elastic than we previously thought. Basically, your eyes, your ears, whatever it is that's sort of the kind of hardware that's attached as a peripheral really doesn't matter for the brain. The brain is just looking for signals and can interpret them whether they are coming through your eyes or coming through a secondary, tertiary sensory perception that you hadn't had prior. The body can actually adapt to it. The other one is, say, neuroenhancers, like chemicals. So most of us are familiar with the physiological side of it, people who are athletes or bodybuilders, people who take steroids to get bigger, go faster, run faster, do this, that, or the other. But it's actually also known that scientists, the journal Nature did a study about 5 years ago, which found that something like 35% of scientists polled actually take chemical enhancers for work. So usually they're beta blockers of some sort that allow them to concentrate for longer periods of time in order to produce the grants that are necessary to support their work. And so this isn't something that's simply done as a kind of physiological production of muscles and speed for athletes. It's actually something that's done through cognition in order to develop an edge in the competition. And then, of course, the best ones are always the do-it-yourselfers, right? So people who've kind of take it upon themselves to find things and then experiment on themselves. So this is someone who's seen research being done with a form of chlorine A6 that when droplets are placed in the eyes for roughly 2 hours, he can see then at dusk, as the sun sets, in the ultraviolet range. So he can basically see at night through the ultraviolet range. So if you have our spectrum of light, infrared is to one side, ultraviolet is to the other, just gives him the ability to see kind of in the dark for a period of time. I have no idea what the lasting results are to his eyes after this photograph, but I don't think his insurance covers that. What I'd like to highlight here, though, is a kind of shift from medical care, from repair and optimization of the body function, to a state of continual monitoring and reporting. So just to kind of underline there, those are a couple of examples in which there is a lineage in history of us trying to repair the body to a so-called average state, right? So you're born with 20/20 vision, you have hearing. These are sort of known averages. If you were born without the ability to hear or certain frequencies or see, you get glasses. These are things that we do for hearing aids to kind of bring us back to a state of so-called average condition. But within our lifespan now is we're kind of at this unique state in which doctors have to kind of stop, because you can actually get better vision than 20/20. You can actually hear outside the spectrum of 20 to 20,000 hertz. These are things that we can actually exceed. So we're kind of a unique moment where we're not reaching the point of bringing people simply back through medical devices and operations to an ideal norm. We can actually exceed that norm. The question is, will we? And of course the answer is yes, because we just do. The monitoring, and so the switch from that into the idea of a kind of monitoring logic. So the monitoring of the body's physiological, and therefore one would assume eventually psychological, emotional state, provides architects with a source of reliable information, one that hasn't existed prior to today's collection of large data groups. This perpetual feedback loop transcends the body and includes the incorporation of context itself that the body moves within. A communication and dialogue between the body and the context it is situated within also serves to collapse the distinction between the two. And so looking here at slides of a rural condition, a suburban condition, and an urban condition. And now thinking about the human body, with the phone in the pocket, the idea of now thinking about that our bodies now are kind of assuming this idea of urban, of rural, suburban, and urban, not based on infrastructure in the landscape that a kind of body then moves through, but that actually now is being absorbed by the body itself. So density is a measurement of accumulation in regards to our cities, going beyond physical mass of buildings. It can also measure information and resources. The usefulness of that density is related to the proximity of the human body to that accumulation. So this is in the kind of upper level. In terms of environments, this is broadly characterized as urban, suburban, or rural. In this example, density is geographically static, and it is the body that transitions between, in, and around. But when density of information and accumulation of resources is transferred to the body, what are the implications to the geographic locales and the architectural shapes that define them? When information resources are increasingly accessible to the body, the city is no longer solely around the body as physical context, but also in the body. Then we're discussing an urbanization of the body. What specifically does it mean to have an urbanized body? And can we think of bodies either as singular states chosen by individuals or phased over a duration of time as urban, suburban, and rural? Designing to meet a preconceived bodily quote-unquote average according to proportion, ergonomics, and sensory perception can potentially shift to acknowledge a spectrum of body function. The urban, suburban, and rural bodies will move amongst each other at all times. As the body is increasingly urbanized, internalizing access to information and the services related to communication, health, and commerce, the built environment that the body moves through is required to take on new responsibilities and shapes. In other words, opportunities are available for architects to reimagine not only the architectural form that the body moves within and around, but the fundamental dialogue between the architectural shape and the human body's engagement of those shapes. So this goes back to the idea of the touch. Both are open for design. The two are capable of being tuned to one another like never before. If biological and technological advancements before were applied to the body for repair of injury, one could say that this offered the possibility for a more shared potential experience. As the body is often judged on criteria of acceptable norms, sensory perception related to sight, hearing, or mobility, each requires a manipulation of either the body or the sight to make a public space capable of being experienced and shared equally. This quote-unquote repair associated with the increased medical knowledge and technological offers the opportunity for spatial environments to be experienced by all and offer a shared public space. When this is not possible, when physical space is manipulated to meet standards of accessibility like ADA accessibility, As individuals choose to exceed our sensory averages through wearables and bioengineering, shared public space has the potential to fragment even further. So that's just to say that when we think about this idea of repair, the idea is to actually allow access to public space, meaning if you can get people to a space, then it becomes shared public space, whether it's through transportation, public transportation, whether it's through accessibility. But once we're all in this room, the assumption is that all of us now are sharing the same space. But, I mean, just as a guess, if one or two of you are on the phone right now checking the news, you technically could be seen as being in another space. You have access to information that others don't. And so when we start layering this information onto the body, we start to realize that even though people are all physically in the same space, you may be experiencing different space. This raises the question of what communal space and subject experiences means for public shared space. Many will choose to engage the internal urbanization of our bodies with devices on a sliding gradient of integration, no different from the urban, suburban, and rural densities of populations that exist outside our bodies. But who chooses to engage and who options out and why? Are these reasons social economic? Are they religious? Are they generational, political, or forms of protest? Beyond not knowing what our technological futures hold, architects can't even assume to know who we're designing for, never mind how they will use it. When both the human body and the environment are located within this engagement, the first through the colonization of technologies and the second a willful manipulation of both local microclimates and global environments, a negotiation occurs that implies a degree of impact on both the body and the environment. When this is done intentionally through design, it could be said that the two are tuned to one another. In such an approach, architecture could not be seen as a third party built to mediate between body and environment, but instead, architectural design would be the design of the context where the two parties, body and environment, are tuned to be more actively tuned to one another. So instead of thinking of architecture as that mediation device between an environment and a body, architecture in this case is a relational existence between tuning the body to that environment. It's more of an act of design and negotiation and interface than it is an artifact that mediates the two. So architectural space is essentially a tuned touch between environment and body. Less of a mediation between than more of a tuning, like a receiver to a multiplicity of radio signals in the air. So we think about, obviously the example here is to say that we already do this. This is not something that is some radical thought. And one of the clearest examples would be to say that we do this with street lighting. And so through the advent of say, something like street lighting, we have a physical space. I would consider this to be an architecture. It has a shape. It has an interior. It organizes activities. It allows for recreation. It allows for commerce. It opens the nighttime to use that it didn't prior. And it's actually tuned to the human body. So when we think about street lighting, we're not recreating the sun. This isn't an attempt to create something that we already know. This is actually to say we create light only within the spectrum that the human body perceives. So we see the visible spectrum, which is about 400 to 700 nanometers. This is our blue to our red spectrum, and it's tuned to our human body. So it's very possible that other animals don't see this. This is just for the human perception. And then the question here then is to say, could we start thinking of street lighting in such a way where we start adding other material systems onto this? Can we start thinking like, well, if we can actually sense and augment other perception, can that be taken up by something like street lighting or other forms that the two can be tuned to one another? And so street lighting is important for many reasons, but it actually has changed how we live. It's not just an architectural object. It's not just a technological device. It's actually something that changed how we engage city streets. It's how we engage public parks, and changed how we think of activities themselves. But this is a kind of, there are a couple of things that make street lighting interesting, for me at least. One of them is the fact that when you think about street lighting, it has a couple of characteristics that are unique to it. One, which is that when you start thinking about this spectrum of light and the kind of history of this and the fact that lighting that we see today is in a continual flux. I mean, it has gone through different iterations of chemical processes and availability of technologies and efficiency, is that this itself as an infrastructure doesn't have to change. If you want to update that, you simply update the light bulb. So there's an efficiency with a kind of malleability to this system in the sense that you don't have to reconstruct an entire new building or system. You sort of just change the light bulb itself and it changes the entire kind of aesthetic of the project. And we know this with something like, this is an example of Los Angeles that shifted to LED lighting. And in the shift of LED lighting didn't just simply change from efficiency modeling to a cheaper light bulb, it actually changed the color spectrum of the lighting that you get. So the same city street photographed, with LED on the right and the previous prior to it, you actually start to see that it actually has an aesthetic relationship between the two. When we start thinking about things like street lighting, is to say that this isn't all a kind of utopic vision of like what the world should be or what our opportunities are kind of foreshadowed here. It's also to be able to think about what the ramifications of these things are. So something as discrete and localized as street lighting does have ramifications that exceed its kind of boundaries. So one street lighting is one thing. Street lighting at this level, it creates light pollution. And so what you're looking at here are intensities of light. Obviously you can see, well, so probably around where we are, and has created issues where there are becoming a limited amount of places on the globe actually where you can go and actually see the night sky in a kind of unpolluted environment, simply because of the light pollution moving out of the kind of city itself. Chicago is an interesting example because under Mayor Daley, he, in order to fight crime, lit everything. It's like everything was lit, all back alleys was to such an extent that actually now under Rahm Emanuel and future mayors as well, is actually a removal of lighting within the city because of the sort of extent that we're starting to find out access or connection or having too much access to that lighting at night actually affects your sleepy rhythm. So people who actually live in cities that are overly lit are actually finding out that their circadian rhythm is actually changed. And so when we start thinking about things like material energies, these are the kind of other side of the equation. Not only we're not talking simply about the body, but we're talking about the environment itself. And so in this case, it's everything from how we store energy. So conversations today from things like Tesla and their battery factory and battery technologies of being able to store this energy for use where you pull it from, but then being able to deploy it. Things like sound. This is a kind of military example. Unfortunately, most things come out of the military in terms of technology researching. But this is an example of sound that it's often used now in the Navy, but also in cruise ships. It's a way in which you can localize and focus sound to the point where it becomes like a laser. You can actually focus it on the body and cause physical pain without killing them unless you really turn it up. It's a deterrent to things like lighting. And so this is kind of rather intriguing and actually something I didn't know about until reading an article in the Chicago Tribune about, and I'm not sure if it's cold enough here to have access to this on the buses and trains, but in Chicago, the trains and buses have this heat lamps that are up for you when you're waiting for the train. What's really interesting about it is that it's actually not there to give you heat. It's actually not there to warm your body through radiation. Through sort of like the heat itself of the lamp. What it's actually doing is it's looking for exposed skin, and it actually vibrates the water molecules in your skin, and those water molecules vibrate, and that gives the feeling of warmth. And so what's really interesting is that it's far infrared light. So it's the same stuff that you have in a sauna. If you've ever been to a sauna and the heat that's being given off when you're sitting in the sauna, usually in a towel or in your bathing suit, is the exposed skin. What's interesting about this is we don't even know how to use this technology. We don't even know that the technology is out there and what it's used for. So if you're ever in the position, again, to be in Chicago or somewhere that has this, is actually if you take off your hat, loosen your coat, and sit under that with more exposed skin, you'll likely feel more warm than if you keep your hat on and your coat on. It's because the whole point of it is for it to actually reach your skin. And so there's an interesting dialogue here between technologies and things that are being exported into the common day use of our cities. Yet in terms of things like our clothing and how we experience and know about it, there's a kind of lag between its intentions and its kind of physiological operations of how the body works and how the technology works and how we even understand it or what to do with it. And so this is just to say, when we're looking at things like material energies, we have a different conversation than we think of geometry. So when we think about stuff like, chipboard or, drywall or wood or concrete, steel, and glass, these are kind of ossified energy. This is solid energy, and we understand that as such. That creates physical boundaries, meaning you either pass through it or you don't, or you create an aperture and you cut through it. When you think about energy, it actually works on a kind of different series of relationships. So I'm not going to go into this in any real detail, but it's to say that we've worked with these energies for hundreds of years, thousands of years. We work with them as kind of auras and effects. These are things that we look at that are kind of qualitative, hand gesture-like beauties of light bouncing off of things that give impressions. We've worked with them to produce comfort, so heating and electrical, that allow us to have a level of comfort, meaning relative humidity in this room, temperature of this room, light levels. These are ways in which we've harnessed energy to a kind of preconceived notion of comfort. And we've been doing this since, with mechanical engineering and the advent of mechanical engineering in the late 1800s, this has been a rather standard practice. As we start getting into things, when we talk about acoustics and the chemical and the thermodynamic, electromagnetic, we actually start moving into various ranges. So we have the trophic, which is to say, you could think about lighting in terms of what it produces, not simply as access to information, but what it does for the health of the body. So we know that when you spend too little time in front of the sun, you don't get enough vitamin D. And that produces seasonal affective disorder like depression. And so things like energy are tied not simply to delight or comfort, but it's actually produced to health. As you move in, informational. So this is like street lighting, to say, when you see that street lighting, that shows you a physical space, right? I can choose to go into that light, and if I was doing that on a city street, I would have some degree of safety, right? Because I'm in a lit area. I would have access to information. I could read a newspaper on my phone. I could play recreation. All these things are coming through it, right? This is all from informational space. But I could also run straight through it. It doesn't physically stop my body from moving through that space. I can go for a jog and move from one street light to the next. The third, though, is physical. And this is when stuff like that sound cannon is an example of, or light as a laser, in which things can get focused to the point where they actually cause physical harm, or cause like the same harm that would come to me if I choose to make that a door right now. I'd get knocked out. So there is a physical component to the energy itself, and it works with this kind of gradient. I'm going to skip over those two people. So when we think about this, we kind of move along this trajectory, a kind of previous known trajectory where we know more about the body, and the more we know about the body, like our circulation system, our optics, our genetic sequencing of our body, that gives us more information about how we control material. We know more about these things. They help us to do things like mediate the environment and controls. They protect us for exploration, like deep space or ocean explorations. So the more we know about the body, the more we can kind of shape materials to protect the body or enhance the body. But now we're kind of in a unique period of time where both our bodies and our relationship to the environment itself are both in flux. So one isn't a kind of priori approach to the other. We don't know more about one to then shape the other. Both can kind of influence each other. And so speed, variability, and updatability appear to be a new constant for the shapes that we give space. Incorporating these new constants into how architectural shapes are defined are important because of the ongoing evolution of communication, perception of, and building assemblies, as well as are still unknown implications ahead on the environment and the subjectivity of the individuals occupying those spaces. Pliability is associated with architectural shape, while stasis becomes synonymous with architectural form. Techniques that represent space and the relationships of the bodies, environments, and communications for the architect, tentacles might best be seen as interfaces with potential change. The future is neither predictable nor constant. On one hand, the need is there for us to suss out plausible outcomes of technologies and how people use them. On the other hand, more important to the architect, shape must be given to the spaces people occupy as the human body interfaces with the environment it is situated within. This interface is between the body, personhood identified or constructed at that moment, assembled, reassembled, removed, and edited in parallel with the environmental context it is located within. This interface is a sort of touching that brings shape and identity. Without the manifestation of a shape, such constant change in technological updates, advancements and repercussions could very well produce an anxiety to the engaged population. So simply to say, with those changes occurring, there's a kind of opportunity and responsibility within architecture to actually give them shape. This anxiety is rooted in a concern about unknown consequences. Architectural shapes would therefore appear to be an opportunity to be in dialogue with information technologies and the engaged individual. But for this to happen, that architectural shape would presumably be required to be imbued with some degree of latent knowledge of potential consequences. This tension would be between architectural shapes that are physically identifiable, yet simultaneously capable of an internal latency, called forward when required. Architecture in this scenario requires flexibility in its shape. So again, a little bit like the street lighting, the ability for that to be turned on, off, or brightened or reduced. Not necessarily kinetically moving, but possibly phasing changes, updatable or malleable like our climactic environments. If architectural forms are static images of representations in singular geometric built responses, then architectural shapes are elastic and plastic, capable of adaptation and response both through the tools of design and the spaces we define. And so just as a couple of examples of just ways in which these can be explored, these are just a couple of, it's going to show three kind of projects that tackle the same conversation through different types of prototypes. And that's just simply to say, there's no one way to do this. So even within a singular practice, the attempt is to try to figure out how can we have this conversation when it's not simply only about an image of a project, but actually trying to tease out some of those ramifications. So in this case, these are a series of photographs I did a number of years ago, a couple of years back, that were looking at how to kind of set up a stage for just one photograph. And so this was looking at an open landscape that had the need for production of physical spaces that could carry activities and events and actions. So a little bit like that street lighting logic, how do we take that as a kind of early sample that then can be layered with additional possibilities? So this is actually a kind of base plate that then has these kind of artificial suns that can move on and off site. So they're honed to a plate, and when they're not needed, they can actually move off site and be stored. And so these produce a kind of convection cycle of lighting and heating for this space in which these three individuals are kind of tuned to it and are aware of it, while a fourth person might not be. And so how do we start thinking about these spaces and who has access to these spaces and who could potentially be in a space but not have access to the information being shared? And these are just a couple of examples. That was that last photograph. So this is almost a 4-foot by 5-foot stage that was built for one photograph. This was a even larger kind of series of models that were then kind of collapsed for a kind of singular photograph. And this being, again, the same kind of typology, looking at the sun and a ground plane, and thinking about how these bodies, when they come in contact with this space, and what kind of sensory perception they have to the space and how that changes when another individual comes in. Does the space actually expand or grow? Does it shrink? Does the kind of relationship of the space actually evolve? And so you're looking at, that's another detail of it. And so something a bit like the street lighting, where you're looking at a singular space, a secondary kind of archipelago space that when get clustered together actually can create larger regions of spaces, where something that's seen as a singular mode or two singular conditions can actually create in the background much larger kind of regional moments. And so this is to say these are Odum diagrams. So this is a kind of diagram technique that was developed in the 60s and 70s by someone named Odum, who was looking at a way in which you could look at information, how it moved on and off site. And so you could draw these for cities, you could draw these for regions, you could draw these for small plots of land. And what this is looking at energy translation. So everything in white is a climactic site. So this is air velocity, this is temperature of the site, this is precipitation, solar. And then these are, on the project, these are energies that are being given off. So they range from the power supply to lighting, to spectrums of lighting, to heating and cooling, to kind of create this kind of convection cycle of a space. And what you're looking at in the dotted is what I would consider to be the architectural shape. So this is the relationship between when an existing context comes in contact with a source point. So at that point, that's the kind of physical boundary of space. And the point is simply to say, this could be a liability. So someone would say, you're just wasting energy, putting energy out in the environment, like lighting outside. But the reality is that it actually also causes the possibility for something to actually be tunable, meaning when you don't need it, it goes away. But that same space actually has a kind of interesting aspect to it, which is when any category on the outside changes, meaning it gets cooler or hotter, if this constant inside, if the energy on the outside stays constant, you're going to get a different shape, right? So the idea of, think of it like a campfire, is if there's a certain temperature outside and a certain light level, and you have logs on the fire, and then it gets colder all of a sudden, your little zone of heat and warmth and light just got smaller because of a pressure on the outside. And it's your choice. Do you want to put another log on the fire and grow the zone again? If you do that, the fire is going to change, right? It's going to get hotter because they have more logs on it, which means it's probably going to change color. It's going to get bigger, and your zone will get bigger. So there's a relationship between how much output you want and what size of space you want. And it's not a limitation or a liability. It's actually potentially an opportunity for architecture to think that aesthetics and qualities can actually be variable and not necessarily a limitation. And I won't go into too much detail with it, but this is kind of an example of that, in which if you look at a boundary, so this could be that street lighting, this could be that project I just showed, and E is the energy being released, and X is the climactic variable, so how hot it is, how cold it is, whatever those things are. Those are pressing on that, and when X gets bigger, E gets smaller, because it's pressing on it. The question is, if you want to then increase E, meaning more electromagnetic, more thermal, more heat, you can maintain your boundary of the original, but you're going to change probably the characteristics of it. It'll get brighter, the colors will change, other things. So you can actually change, you can maintain physical boundary when necessary, but it does have a ramification to the qualities of that space. This one was a series of prototypes called Mounds. And so this was for the Chicago Public Parks District up in Chicago. The idea was to look at, in Chicago, has an amazing park system that unfortunately shuts down for months at a time, right? It gets so cold outside, no one uses the park systems. We know that when we're looking at street lighting, that Central Park, for instance, when it originally started, didn't actually have any lighting. And so the park actually closed at night. As street lighting became more and more readily available, the park was open all night. And so the question here is, can we actually start thinking about maybe not changing the Chicago park districts to be a kind of interior on the exterior, but can you actually start thinking about manipulating little microclimates for access and for even as a public health resource? And so these are a series of boulders that are then kind of grouped together in different sizes and configurations. So even though you're dealing with, this is a half scale version. So these are about 3 feet round. This is about 2 feet. That these are the kind of base units, and then from there, they can be aggregated in a range of sizes, from small kind of groupings to much larger zones, to even smaller kind of conditions within the parks. And so what you're looking at here is just a kind of smaller study model of that with each of these, and then the grass that kind of grows between them. And what we're looking at was these are made out of concrete. Their inside is a kind of hollow shell that then has an electrical heating coil that runs through it. Each of these, then it's actually cast with concrete. With that heating on, these get to about 110 degrees, which is sort of like warm skin. So they actually give off heat. Excess heat that is not taken in by the body goes into the soil, so that you start creating these kind of microclimates within the soil that have temperature that could potentially grow vegetation or grasses for longer periods of the year. And then we're working with these kind of lenses that are inserted here. And the idea with this is actually to start working with resources that already exist. So there's a long lineage, obviously, we know within, say, architecture, in which architects rarely produce new representational techniques. We kind of borrow, and technologies themselves that we kind of co-op. And the question is, in this case, we know that people like corporations like Philips, General Electric, Herman Miller, Steelcase, companies you're all familiar with, are actually working with technologies like blue light or spectrum light that are used for offices. So this is all work that's done inside existing offices to actually give you light during the winter months to help you with seasonal affective disorder, or sound cancellation devices now within offices that aren't about cubicles. They're just small cones that beam down that you can't see that actually cancel noise in certain areas. So if there are 50 people here, you could have 50 separate cones all tuned to 50 different TVs. There wouldn't be any physical boundaries here, but you would all be in different spaces. And so the idea is, by working with those technologies, something like that lighting and that sound can be embedded within these to actually create small little microclimates of space. And much like fluoride, good or bad, fluoride is often integrated in drinking water as a way of dealing with healthy bones. At least it was for a long period of time. It was in the water supply. Add fluoride into the water supply, it helps with your teeth and bone density. So fluoride was in many ways a kind of aspect of preventative medicine that we all kind of literally drank growing up, at least in certain regions of the States. And so the question is, can we think of the parks or these kind of technologies in these landscapes as being a form of preventative medicine? Like, can we think of lighting and these kind of warm in these zones as actually things that people could use and come to in the city parks during certain winter months to actually get these vitamins and such within the body? And these are just examples of these things, fabricated and molded and cast. Very messy. So I moved out of this space about 4 months ago, and most of my money from this space went into new plumbing in terms of so much stuff that was poured down, sinks that were never intended. This is the Monadnock building in Chicago. One of my favorite absolute buildings. It hurt me to have to leave and replace plumbing. And this is another version within this conversation, which is to say, and this was sort of born from that last project, which is making these prototypes and these models. One of the interesting things about working with these energy systems is that they're not scalable. So anyone who's working on architecture or in landscape, we often use abstractions to stand in for something, right? You make a physical model, and maybe it's out of foam, maybe it's out of something else, and it stands for something, right? And you kind of abstract it as a material that would eventually mean it's going to be concrete, it's going to be wood, we'll work it out. But a piece of foam core more or less abstracts your interest in what it will be later, right? It's about being a dimension. When you start working with energy, though, or any form of this energy, you can't scale down thermodynamics. You can't scale down gradient forms of energy, of temperature. They essentially work at, like I showed in that last one, half scale is about as small as I would really go, if I wanted to get an understanding of how something was going to perform. But while we were working on those, realizing too is, how do we think about the body? Like, how do we think about who's using these spaces, and how would they be engaging it? Would it just be something as simple as that kind of scale figure I showed, a random person, man, woman, weight, height? Like, is that sufficient to talk about space anymore, or is that sort of an old model that we need to kind of move on from? And so this was an approach for Izzy, which is basically to say, can we come up with a kind of scale model that we could use within our designs that we could think about who we were designing for? And it wouldn't be based on anything in terms of like the ergonomics of a body, meaning my height, my weight, 18 inches for me to sit down, 40 inches for me to work on a table. Instead, we're talking about sensory perception. And so with Izzy, it's a way of thinking about a kind of base condition with these collars, and each collar has a different sensor within it. So within that, we're talking about somebody, we could actually think about communities or talk about people or make generalizations or things that we think people would be attuned to or possibly have or have in the future, that we can actually start using these as a kind of stand-in as a kind of model making, whether that be physical or maybe even computer generated. And so these then become kind of samples of them where we're working with a kind of base, top and bottom. We have the collar that holds the sensor, and then we have an acrylic ring that indicates the color spectrum. So each one of these is tuned to a kind of level of support. So you're looking at here where we go from health to human senses to artificial senses. And when the colors go from white to red, the spectrum is of more or less of that. And so we're looking at things like health and safety, like air particulates and gases that are being picked up, a kind of air gap for sampling, whether it's going from a base condition to a more red. Human senses, the things that we kind of have already or are more attuned to our known conditions, to more artificial kind of explorations of electromagnetic or colors being spectrums of light that are beyond our visible spectrum, and being able to think about those so that when we look at something like Izzy can give us different directions or different indicators of what's being sensed and how. And so we build a physical environment, our model that we're kind of mapping out. This then gives us an understanding of what's being picked up, either kind of tactily, by senses down here that could be related up here, or by movement of air and light that's being perceived. And so this is kind of a way of thinking about how can we think about the human body through these sort of sensory perceptions as another mechanism. And so the interface between the human body and the environment it's situated within requires additional models of understanding, prediction, and action. Just as human proportion and ergonomics have long influenced architectural form in the past, continued pursuits of knowledge and the advancements of human physiology and psychology will re-inform shapes we give our architecture. But without the simultaneous consideration of the environment along with the body, the repercussions of such actions might remain unknown or simply neglected due to our disciplinary culture of avoidance. These actions associated with the architecture are best understood as the design techniques and strategies used for design development. Without committing to the development of such techniques of its own, architecture could very well suffer the appearance that its design projections put forth are based on assumptions that belong to other professions, and possibly even worse, that the discipline is unaccountable for its actions. Increased knowledge about the workings of the human body not only informs a better understanding of ourselves, but also can unintentionally produce a measuring stick in which assumptions and abstractions about our surrounding environments are judged against. Which simply to say is the more if we judge through our own bodies and our own personhood, that's basically how we perceive and understand the environment around us. That's the lens we produce. So spaces ranging in scale from rooms, parks to cities and regions are each environmentally shaped in our image. It is therefore necessary to question whose bodies are being used for these measuring sticks. What assumptions are being made about the human health and comfort? And are the human bodies of today assumed to be the human bodies of our children or our children's children? Who and when are architecture designing for? Increased information and focus about ourselves might draw lines that work to further separate us from other species and biologies that share our environments. A communication and dialogue between the body and the context it is situated within also serves to collapse the distinction between the two. When the body and the environment are closely tuned to one another, an increased awareness of each other's behavior and wellness can be expected. This awareness opens the potential for more string figures between the two and the limits of the strategies of the sequestering or avoidance of the politics, science, and design among humanity and the environment. Both are open for design, and the two are capable of being tuned to one another. The progression forward would appear to some to be a technological question, one that requires better understanding of human biology, environmental science, computer science, and artificial intelligence to help guide the future forward. Yet the future isn't technological. Acting and responding to known knowns only reinforces a type of blind faith that cedes responsibility to the data information currently available. Attempting to flush out new unknowns for the pursuit of design solutions is not novel within architecture. Techniques including scenario building, narratives, projections, fiction literature are well known and used by architects. Tentacle shapes serve primarily as a reminder that the speed in which change is occurring in the sciences, politics, and environment and our bodies heightens the need to loop strings and tentacles among and between them all. Assumptions bore, and the imagination takes effort. If crises are to be diverted, perspectives reshaped, and fantastical futures explored, it's unlikely to occur solely through the technological solutions, but instead a cultural reorientation born from the tentacles put forth, bridging and touching new unknowns. Thank you.
Question, sure. But I feel like one of the things that goes through a lot of this discussion is the formation of some kind of norm or base condition against which we have on one side something like, use the word pollution as in like pollution, or enhancement on the other, which brings in this whole question, I think, of something between terminology and intention, meaning, right, and exactly, because you also talked about public space. So if you have a set of people mediating with their environments, you also have many different ways that they might do this and intentions in that. So you have, it just seems to me there's pairs of conflicts that I'm wondering how much you see ways towards dealing with this, right? The conflicts between either what some people see as pollution or we don't know is pollution versus enhancement. They could certainly all be the same. So part of this is also, I mean, there's many things, and it's because you touched on so many, and they're very interesting, is this arc of what language you use, right? Because essentially you're stealing, a lot of those terms have some kind of value associated with them compared to just defining them as different states of being. So I'm wondering how much you, either think you need to really revamp the sort of how we talk about these things, even sort of saying the use of the word body. And what sense that makes in that. Because every time you return to that norm, I think it also places it into that spectrum of the good and bad technology, right, which it sounds like is just technologically driven. You know, how much do you think, in order to really address these issues, have this develop in some better than worse ways in the world, we need to really change the entire way they're discussed? Am I getting at anything that you feel like you can resolve?
Yeah. No, for sure.
I don't know if any of this making sense, but
yeah,
there's
for sure.
a chain of things that go through this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I honestly, I don't like to foreground a talk through by making an excuse, but like that is a little bit why I was trying to mention that this is a kind of work in progress, because there are a lot of these hurdles that are out there, trying to figure out how to kind of tackle them. And so, and part of this is a means for trying to, I mean, if I was to kind of scale them down, like trying to figure out what are potential pitfalls that I hadn't even thought of. So one of them you kind of alluded to, which is the idea of communal space. Like, what is communal space when there's a potential for fragmentation of it? You know, when the idea of engaging a diverse body or bodies may at one point seem a necessary exploration and acknowledgement, how do we also at the same time allow for a communal shared space? Or how does that exist? Or how do we address that? And so that's kind of one tier, like the kind of bigger kind of objectives. And so one of them being the idea of the suburban urban rule, like the fact that we could have multiple bodies in the space that are actually now on a spectrum of engagement. The secondary aspect, within that is, like you mentioned, like how does this not fall into a spectrum of binaries, where, like you said, one versus the other, like I keep putting in quotes the idea of average or norm. Like, how does that not fall into one or the other, but kind of maintain a kind of gradient or spectrum of engagement? And I don't know. I mean, I don't know how that exists right now. And I don't know if part of it is, part of the way I'm working on it now is actually a kind of fundamental shift for me, which is not writing another book about this, but actually trying to write a series of, maybe this is a good place to discuss it, first-person nonfictions story, like ways of going through this, where they become kind of scenario building, the same way you would scenario build designs and say, this is for this production or this typology or this location. Can there also be kind of large briefs for each of those as well that don't try to tackle a whole, like don't try to make this a kind of polemic? And that's kind of what I'm trying to shift away from, that this is somehow going to be a book, or this is somehow going to be a 50,000-word manifesto of this issue, and instead it's going to have to be a small series of kind of like chips that are controlled, because I don't know, in any other way it would seem irresponsible.
I wanted to maybe continue the discussion of language, but not language in terms of words, but language in terms of form, which is always an issue when you're dealing with things that are outside of form or exceed that in terms of perception, like atmospheres, thermodynamics, acoustics, etc. But at some point, there are receptacles, right? At some point, there are boulders. At some point, you're manipulating the landscape. And I wanted to ask about your motivation in relation to the condition of form for this, or the containers themselves, because even though they're secondary, at some point, there's kind of the lunar landscape that emerges, right? So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a fundamental question. And I think there's a couple ways of tackling it. One is to say that it's often easy to confuse for myself, and I think sometimes looking at these, where the design is, or like where the project is. And so for me, like when you're looking at something, even just like this image, how much of it is about that shape of intersecting spheres and that kind of carpet of space, and how much of it is the kind of electrical field that's being produced. And my personal interest is that if I was to look at this as an image, or if I was to map this as a gradient of light and temperature of where physical space in the body would be, that I would put my chips on that as the project. And say, if you don't like spheres or circles, you could do it with cubes and something else. Like that my interest is that, so if this is the bread of the sandwich and that's the meat, that's the meat. That's what I'm trying to work on. And so it's a kind of non-answer in the sense that this idea of the shape touches is to say, unfortunately or /fortunately, those two other things matter less now. And because these are the parts that we're going to be experiencing. And that, just like street lighting in a way, the shape of that pole can be a discussion, but at the end of the day, it's going to be what the lighting does in terms of what access it produces. And we can have a discussion about that, whether it's bronzed or whether it's steel or whether it hangs here or does that. It's going to come down to more about what kind of lighting we're putting in it and what kind of spectrum of shape that lighting is producing. I don't necessarily know if that's a good or bad thing, but it does make the discussion of the light pole more difficult.
Yeah, I would say that at some point there's still a limit condition, right? Like there is a difference between the sort of the orb floating, being a series of intersecting cubes, et cetera, versus something that's circular, depending on how, or spherical, depending on how they're operating. In the same way that even if we say that there's different different ways in which the object or all the things that are being designed are interfacing with us. So even if how the iPhone works and all the information that's in it might be the most important thing, there's still a moment of scale, right? Or fitting in my hand. And the rounding of the edges in relation to that and how big it can be, because at some point it's about that. In the same way that, you know, if there are 3 bodies that are floating on that circled surface, that's setting up something that's different than if there are 5 bodies, or if it's a different kind of shape, et cetera. So I would say it's never irrelevant. It might not be the focus if your focus is on the meat in the sandwich there, but at some point it becomes still a kind of critical part, even at the edges of the project. And also in terms of how these things get inserted, you know, because I kept thinking about like these boulders, for example, the difference between the way in which you design them appearing to us as something that is obviously different and from somewhere else, or obviously about a kind of artifice, versus them being surreptitiously inserted within a kind of landscape that somebody would come upon, and the difference between how we would interact with it because of that. So I do think at some point it becomes a critical part of the agenda somewhere, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so when we're looking at these, and these have the kind of 3 sizes, there's definitely, it's not an arbitrary scaling. I mean, there are specifically for climbing, and there's a size in which that which is, you know, again, you can't escape a certain height level. So if you're at 18, 20 inches, they are, you know, even though we're kind of, the focus is in the ergonomics of the body, the ergonomics are still part here. That smaller boulder is 18 inches because that's good usually for sitting and for your legs to hit the ground. And another one is a larger size because that allows, you know, so that is sort of embedded in it and certainly still a part of the project. It's just not the largest focus of the project. And it's a conversation that over, you know, a decade or more, I still don't have a good answer for, because it's the kind of thing where I feel like that variability can change along the route of trying to produce the kind of the middle zone, and in a weird way, it causes an issue because I don't defend that. I'm trying to defend the system in play, not the kind of artifact. But it's also to say it's not that I don't have interest in that. Clearly, I wouldn't spend this much time building these damn models if I didn't have an interest in it.
I'll try to formulate a question here. I like the way Nana went about this and just started talking and see what comes out. One of the things
She did a little better than that.
Yeah. Thanks. So one of the things I think that gets brought up in the work is this kind of customization of perception, and we see, you know, we've seen that through social media and this idea that everyone can have their own essentially version of the world, and how that's then curated for us in many ways. And I think what I start to pick up on as you present the work here is there's a you know, while each person has their kind of realm that they're experiencing, and that might get tighter and tighter, what it seems to do is begin to push this idea of civic space away, right? And that because of this kind of mass customization of perception, we no longer start to have these spaces that are civic. And I think even more importantly, then it becomes difficult to think about who's in control of those spaces, but then also how resistance might ever even occur, right? And so I don't know if there's any kind of things you're looking at in that realm, like how civic space might be collapsed, and how kind of these types of technologies might be playing a role in that for good or bad.
Yeah, I mean, one of the lenses I was trying to do that through was the Chicago Park District, which was in Garfield Park, which was this idea of public health. Like, can health be a mechanism for collapsing that? And so that it's not about entertainment or kind of self-creation of space, but actually something that does tie to the health sector of it. And so if these were full spectrum lighting from Philips that allowed for some aspect that could be tied to treatment per day or week or how much you have to get, and there was a kind of thermal aspect to it of temperature and just actually use of it, could we smuggle in shared space and civic space and communal space, not by recreation or access to technologies, but actually things that are kind of baseline. And so I would imagine something like this would have probably different levels, things that are kind of a base condition in which someone who chooses or doesn't have access to any of that stuff can simply go and enjoy and be a part of, and others that could actually tune to it in a kind of more layered way. But that is a big question, which is like how do we not have civic or public space just kind of splinter in the sense that when you do get a bunch of people in one space, they then end up being in different subspaces. The question is that a bad thing? Is that a bad thing for everyone to be in subspaces? Meaning, if just simply being in proximity to groupings, like is that enough to kind of, even if you're only experiencing 50% of a shared space, is that enough for something else to occur? Meaning you don't have a kind of all or nothing logic, and maybe we never did anyway. Hello.
Continue on the idea of civic space. Hannah Arendt talks about the place of public appearance, space of public appearance, and how the unconscious actions of human define who they are, not what they are. And so I'm trying to think about that presumes that we are all being observed by our fellow people sharing these places. So if there's this kind of other level of technology that's sort of hidden from that, can that be brought into a kind of public consciousness so that the the enhanced human or the enhanced space becomes part of that logic, so that there can be the sharing that maybe Brad is worrying that we're losing, but it becomes a kind of an enhanced sharing.
Yeah. Do you mean that in terms of being able to share information gathered, information?
Well, and how one is processing that information.
Oh, I see.
Everybody wearing 3D glasses today. Sorry. Simplify
There's there's that aspect. I think there's also, I think there's different ways of looking at that. One would be, literally shared space of the communal. And I think there's also maybe the idea of tertiary versions of that, which is maybe that information, I'm kind of, not instead of playing the devil's advocate, playing the optimistic here, which is that knowledge about perception through large data groups can give us information that we didn't know about access or use or interests. And so that kind of shared space isn't something that's immediately just shared between a grouping of people through an immediacy, but maybe over periods of time that data can give us information about behavior or use or contact or conversation that maybe can trickle down to a kind of later period of time where the return isn't immediate, but the kind of data allows us to understand behavior in a way that we hadn't thought of otherwise. That would be interesting because then that's not an immediate reply. If it's sort of, I guess the word, it's an unknown. It's like a resulting condition that could play itself out.
Sometimes I feel like this should just be an extended dinner conversation, so I feel sorry for you because it's just round and round. But I'm going to follow up with Nana's comment in that I think you caught yourself in you're relying so much on language that is already spent as a foil for your work that is not allowing you to move forward. And I love this talk because you're out there raw while something's being developed. But conversations about the public today are, and I think about Jane Hutton's work or Jane Bennett's work, that are drawing on John Dewey, the public and his discontents. A allows us to understand that new publics emerge not because of a kumbaya shared common belief, but out of a shared perception of threat.
Mhm.
And to Robin's point, this space of appearance could be a space of appearance of shared perception of threat. Climate change, unknown unknowns, and to understand that there's not one public, there's not one common, that there are these constellations of public that emerge, reassemble, dissolve, and reemerge, and to think that somehow the public realm is not needed because we're not all the same, or that we all have different sensory perceptions, I think undersells what public space can do, which is allow us to acknowledge shared perceptions of threat, where we come together for short periods of time, whether that's political or environmental, and that we then reassemble, disperse, and reemerge again. And so I think your work has the potential to tap into that, but you need a totally different discourse of the public in order to do it, which is not based on a 19th century sense of coming together because we're all alike, but actually coming together because we're afraid of the same thing. We perceive potential of a shared threat. But
Yeah, it's interesting because it's interesting that it's perceived as shared coming together, when in reality the impetus of this is actually threat, which is misuse. Misuse, like misuse of information, misuse of data, misuse of, the perfect example that just was about 2 weeks ago, which is everyone swabbing their cheeks to figure out where they come from. Big news, it just was sold to a pharmaceutical company for $300 million. If you didn't see that coming, I don't know what to tell you. And so that it's actually from that. The kind of project as a whole is about not really being able to be aware of or foreshadow unintended consequences. And so that is the kind of impetus of it. It's sort of funny that it's kind of cashing out as a kumbaya of collective norm or collective whole, when in reality the approach is actually to think not only about unintended consequences of each of these kind of actions, but then also to think, how do we kind of steer it so that if there are collective benefits that we do take for granted, they can be maintained and held. But yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah, sometimes you don't understand how things are perceived or read by an audience until you share them with an audience. But definitely the kind of impetus of it was really a kind of feeling as if everything that we're looking at in terms of a lot of these devices and a lot of these opportunities seem to be idealistic or seem to be very short-sighted. And they don't all have to be problems. There are a lot of secondary opportunities within here. And so that's why this idea of like a shape touch, which is to say, can we think about shape, architectural form and shape as an interaction or an interface? So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is to think, how can we essentially just foreshadow unknowns, and they're not all like idealistic concerns. They're often the pharmaceutical version of your DNA.
Well, my question is probably more of a back to a more physical territory, which is this territory you're designing in is both kind of old in the sense that it's always been a problem to design in a non-visual territory, sensory perception. But then you're also interfacing with new invisible territories. And so my question is, what are the workflows to understand how to bring design along in this territory? What are the various ways of working to actually work with some of the questions that have been brought up, as well as the old questions of, what's the shape of warmth?
coupling those two, I have no idea. But I mean, I could say it in terms of like an arc, in the sense that some projects that I didn't show earlier on were looking at heavily technological representational, like computational fluid dynamics, like doing a lot of work with like that software to understand how air and temperature and humidity were working. So one of them was for a project in Los Angeles. There were these boxes. They were perfect scale. I could build them. I could run simulations with no problem at that scale. I could build prototypes that failed and then try to figure out where the two worked. And then that slowly started working into projects like a development competition in Reykjavik, Iceland, which was for a new airfield in a new downtown. And we ended up creating a series of parking garages that then had earth on top of them. The idea was, instead of to reinforce, it was an old airstrip, instead of to reinforcing the existing kind of linearity of a downtown or new, because they wanted a university and some shopping and all this, we actually created this wash, which was to take all of the excess geothermal energy that was being actually dumped. Actually, so much of it is so efficient, and some of it that there's waste that would go into this brackish period of water that you could swim in to some degree. I mean, it was freezing cold still. But our thought was to actually pump it in the soil. And if you pumped it in the soil, you created this kind of wash that would come up to the buildings that were then on top of these parking garages. Long story short, there's no computational fluid dynamics we could ever run on that. I mean, it would just be completely fictitious at that level. And so we did. It was completely fictitious. We just made drawings that reinforced what we wanted to happen. And I think that was the moment where I was like, okay, I'm just basically reinforcing my own intentions without knowing the science behind it. And I realized at that point, too, that that was a moment of lament, that I was faking it and that this was not real and I was trying to sell it. And then eventually became a turnaround where I was like, that's fine. Like, there's no shame in that. Like, at some point, I have an intentionality and I want to do this, and I think the base science is plausible. And we'll go from there. And so that's like a long way of saying, like, I think it's at some level it's okay to have an intentionality that you have some faith in morally and ethically, that you think it's doable and that, you have a hunch. And then as the resources come into a project, kind of to test them out and see where they go, knowing that you're trying to hold true to some of that base condition. But it is an interesting arc of thinking I had nailed it, moving on to another level, realizing I couldn't do it, feeling a kind of regret and that it was not real anymore, and then eventually realizing that it was actually fine and that that's where the project probably needs to exist, which is in this kind of intentionality.
Keeping the conversation in this corner, and going back to the arc, I understand that you were at the American Academy in Rome, and it reminded me in your provocations of the very first image of the shape and touch, that I assume you went to the Pantheon, where the sun comes in so clearly there, but through the geometries, etc., that are through there, it is this unfolding of the unknown conditions as it hits there, and depending where you're sitting in there, you get all these individual different perspectives and reactions. So my comment is, what did you get out of in this argument about going back the backside, meaning in Rome 2,000 years ago? And if one goes to the Vatican, there's the hand of God that Michelangelo and the hand of Adam and the space almost touching one another in between. So I think it's a profound subject of the relationship or connection to the natural world, both past and ongoing systems. But even the metaphor from Genesis that humankind was made, or man in this case, but humankind was made from taking soil up from the ground and shaping it and touching it, and then Michelangelo, 1,500 years later, or whatever it is, has the space between these two touches. So is there something that the arc of the future could be connected to generative ideas from the past? And I guess it's a way of saying you went to Rome. Is your investigation connected to that in any way?
Originally it was, like so many people who go there, was actually the Nolli plan, and I was going to create a gradient Nolli plan. So I was going to go back to a section and not look at black and white, public-private, but look at the Rome of today in terms of energies, like exhaust and shadow, and actually create a gradient of space based on thermal mapping. And so it wouldn't be black and white, it'd be a gradient condition of space. And then like so many people in Rome, like you just described, you just sort of get overwhelmed, and I did something completely different. And that's actually where the book, The Air from Other Planets, came from. So I wrote that there. And so I don't have a direct answer about the influence of Rome, except my biggest takeaway from there was actually as much the city, but also the people, just the people that I met there, and realizing that as architects, we have a very small spectrum of what we think a practice can be and how you work. And by meeting artists and art historians, I realized there's a lot of ways to skin a cat and get work done, and it doesn't have to be the way we do it as architects. I still haven't capitalized on that thought, but that was one of them. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the intro.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the lecture. It's good. It was good to see the work.
I'm Bill Sherman.
Hi. Oh, hi.
Yeah, I've been following you for a long time.
Oh, thanks.
Great to see
Thanks.
where this is going. So, are you having more visits while you're here
I'm here all week.
this week?
Yeah.
So we should figure out some point to have lunch or something
Sure, yeah.
this week.
Yeah, that's great.
I just want to say, really provocative lecture, best faculty discussion of any
Okay.
lecture conversation.
That's true, yeah, it triggered.
Thanks for coming.
I was holding my tongue in the faculty context, but it's just
Sean, I'll see you upstairs in just a little bit.
Yeah.
Upstairs where?
Right by the like the Elmala Gallery, right in the entrance, by the entrance side.
Oh, where the show was last time? Okay.
yeah, I don't have my
Okay.
card, but it's just Sherman.
Okay, I'll get on the website.
Yeah, you could just find it, but it'd be great
Okay.
to have
Yeah,
this talk.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
Yeah, good, okay.
Good, thank you.